Okay, everyone, let's get started. So, thank you guys for coming again. This is the third installment of our golf swing webinar series. My name is Coach Brian. I'm one of the trainers here at Links Fitness Club, TPI Certified Golf Instructor. And we've also got Ryan Peffer on the line. Ryan is our PGA professional here at Links. He's also the assistant golf coach at Boston College. So Ryan's going to be taking you through some swing thoughts today based on some of the things we talk about, but we're really going to focus on the turn and the pivot today, okay? So kind of similar to what we talked about in some earlier episodes about the difference between feeling like we're swaying off the ball and sliding, we're going to really focus on hip rotation, okay? So to me, one of the biggest differences between the way regular Joes and Janes hit the golf ball and the way that professional golfers hit the golf ball is the way that professional golfers rotate their hips to be able to produce power and produce a consistent strike. Golf is a rotary sport. The golf swing is a rotary motion. And when we get out of that rotation and we get into a sway and a slide, you just see a lot of inconsistencies, a lack of power in particular, but also just a lack of inconsistency on the ball strike. So you hit shots fat, you hit shots thin. And a lot of that is because you're just not rotating and not getting a consistent strike. So we're going to talk about internal rotation of your hip, which is really important. I'll talk a little bit about things we can do from a body and physical standpoint to improve those things. And then Ryan will talk about some of the thoughts you want to have in your swing, the feelings you want to have in your swing to be able to get that sense of rotation and not swaying and sliding. So we're going to start off with some slides here where we go over just some of the musculature that's involved in the golf swing and in the turn in particular. So I want to pull up this illustration here, which I think kind of nicely illustrates what's actually involved in a turn. So if you see here, this gentleman who's got his muscles exposed to us, there's a lot going on when you make a turn. You've got your infraspinatus, which is one of your rotator cuff muscles up in the back of your shoulder, rhomboid major, which is down, also one of the mid-back muscles, your lat, which is that big back muscle that wraps around, and then your external oblique that's really contributing to that twisting motion and that backswing. And what I really want to focus on today is this hip joint, okay? So you can see in the backswing, this lead hip is in external rotation. So we're going to talk a lot about the difference between external and internal rotation and why that's important. But you can see that hip joint is a ball and a socket joint. So this is your femur right here, this long leg bone, and the head of the femur sits into the pelvis in this little slot called the acetabulum. All right, fancy words here, but we'll give you a test at the end. But the femur sits in the acetabulum, and the goal is for that femur head to slide or glide nice and freely inside the head of that acetabulum, or sorry, the socket, which is the acetabulum. So we'll give you a better look from here, just kind of a zoomed in version of what that looks like in your hip. So you can see here, you've got the femoral head, which is this little ball part here. That's the ball part of the socket. And then the acetabulum, which is that little hole part of the socket. So when that femur rotates in, so in this case, if you're picturing this, you would be rotating the femur in towards the midline of your body. That is hip internal rotation. When you move that femur out to the outside of your body, that's hip external rotation. So we want to get the feeling that we're able to actually turn that femur inside the hip socket. Now that can be difficult for a lot of people. A lot of people don't have the requisite mobility to be able to feel that. They might have tight hips. You know, most of my clients complain about having tight hips. That can be the cause of sitting at a desk all day. It could be the cause of not moving around at all during the day. But you have what's called the joint capsule. The joint capsule is not really pictured in here, but it's some tissue that surrounds the femur and the acetabulum, and that's really where things can get sticky and glued down, especially if there's not a lot of movement there. So if you're not walking a lot during the day, or if you're not actually taking the hip through a full range of motion, that joint capsule is going to get really stiff. So that really can affect the way you're able to turn throughout your golf swing. And when you're not able to turn, you end up swaying and sliding. So these are some of the muscles that are involved in hip internal rotation. One of the ones that we want to focus on today is the glute medius. So I call this your side butt muscle. So you've got your glute max, which is your big butt muscle, and then the glute med, which is that side butt. So the glute med abducts your leg, so it brings your leg away from your body, but it also contributes to hip extension, which is when you clear your hips, and then also to internal rotation. It helps turn that femur in towards the midline of your body. You've also got your adductors, which are your groin muscles. So these are really important for a lot of things, and I think they get overlooked a lot, but as you can see in this illustration, those adductors attach from the inside of your femur up to your pelvis. So if you're bringing that femur closer to the pelvis, which is internally rotating it, those adductors are going to be involved to some degree. So adductors are another muscle group that gets really, really stiff on people. Their groin is really, really tight, and a lot of that is just a lack of movement, and it's a lack of being able to activate those muscles as well, because like I said, they just get forgotten. So you can see on the left-hand side here, those adductors kind of attach to the inside of your thigh, but they also go a little bit behind. So they're very close to your hamstrings, and they're grouped behind your leg of the adductors, hamstrings, and then some of the other muscles in the front of your leg that attach, and they get really, 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 really stiff. So what does it look like in the swing? For what does that hip rotation actually look like? So you can see here, one of these, I believe this is Brennan Steele. If you see here on the left, where it says internal rotation of the left hip, you can see that on the downswing, that left hip is actually internally rotating. Now, because his foot is fixed in space, you know, you would think that since he's turning to the outside, that would be external rotation, but because his foot is planted, he's actually twisting that hip in, okay? So internal rotation is really, really important on that beginning, or sorry, the lead leg when you're making your backswing, and then on the trail leg when we're going down to the downswing. So you can see here, external rotation of that right hip, and his hips are completely cleared once he gets to that impact position, which is in that second picture. And we're going to see that differs greatly from normal, well, I wouldn't say normal, but your average Joe or Jane golfer who really lacks that external and internal rotation. So first, let's check internal and external. We'll start with internal rotation. Let's check to see what that looks like. So what is actually internal rotation? So this is a quick test. You can see how well you're rotating your hips. So you can sit on a chair. Chair just has to be tall enough so that your legs are dangling, so your legs aren't flat on the floor. You can take anything you need at your house. You can use a towel. You can use a ball. I'm using a yoga block here just to put between your knees. And what we want to focus on is we drive our knees in, and that drives the lower leg out, okay? So the knees are driving in against the block, and I'm driving my lower leg out. I'm going to do that a couple times. If you know anything about hip internal rotation, you know that this is not very good because mine are really tight, okay? So this is an area I struggle with, and I try to work on a lot. Made some improvement, but not a lot, okay? So that is hip internal rotation. In the golf swing, what that looks like is on the backswing, that trail leg is internally rotating. You can see it's a similar motion. That knee is coming a little bit forward, but because that leg isn't, the foot isn't moving, we're turning on this leg, internally rotating. On the downswing, we shift our weight forward, and then we internally rotate on this lead leg, okay? That's a little bit more of the pivot that Ryan's gonna talk about. So we internally rotate on the trail leg, shift, internally rotate on the lead leg. What if you can't do that? What if you lack that ability, either because you don't have the mobility to do it, you don't have the glute strength to do it, or you just don't have the body awareness to know that that's what you're supposed to do? Well, you end up swaying and sliding. So instead of this turn and this rotary motion, we look like this, okay? That's a sway. So we move from centered over the ball and turning to swaying. And then in order to get back to the ball to make contact with it, we have to slide our hips. So you'll notice that when I'm swaying and sliding, I lose that rotation and I lose that ability to create power because that rotation is no longer there, okay? So let's go back to the slides for 1 second here. And we'll look at this illustration of what a professional golfer's hips are doing during a swing. So this is Brendan Steele. I think it's Brendan Steele. Anyway, he's making a full turn here. And you can see in this, let's look at that second picture here. He's internally rotated on that lead leg. So you can see there, internal rotation of the left hip. And then that right hip has externally rotated fully to complete his backswing. What I want you to notice is where his hips are in that second picture, right where this is his impact picture. His hips have now shifted to the point where they're almost square to his target, okay? What you're gonna see with most amateur golfers, most Joes and Janes, is that their hips stay square to the ball. And that means that they have not rotated and they lost a lot of power and they're probably not gonna hit the ball very solid. So let's look at that from an average Joe perspective. This was the average Joe. I'm not sure if his name is Joe, but he's an average guy. And this is him doing that test I just showed you on the left. I did a little bit better than him, but not much better. So he's got about 10 degrees of hip internal rotation. So what does that mean when he goes to hit the ball? Well, look at where his hips are when he gets to the moment of truth, the impact position. His hips are basically square to the ball still. He hasn't used that rotation force to actually clear his hips and turn through the ball. So once again, to me, this is probably the biggest difference between pro golfers and average golfers. Their ability to swing the club with the rotation of their hips and basically nothing else. They don't use their arms too much with the downswing. They're basically using the rotation of their hips, okay? Here's Adrian Gonzalez, former Red Sox bum, taking a swing. And a baseball swing has a very similar concept with hip internal rotation on that lead leg, or sorry, the trail leg. So look at him load his left leg. This is if he was a left-handed golfer. And he really plants, and this gives him something to drive off of when he goes to hit the ball. So any rotary sport, whether it's tennis, baseball, golf, that rotation of those hips is what produces power. And if you're lacking power, there's a good chance that you're just not using your hips effectively in the swing, okay? So I'm gonna stop there. I wanna throw it over to Ryan. Ryan, why don't you talk about what you see with the hip turn and some of the things that you go over with your students?
Thanks, Brian. So, I mean, really just what you touched on, a player that has their hips pretty much pointing the golf ball. And the better the player is, or at least the better their range of motion, generally they're able to rotate more. So to actually get your hips facing the target at impact is probably too much for almost anyone, unless you're a super elite player. So at impact, I think really if you could get anywhere from what would be considered, if this is facing the target, if you could get anywhere between 30 and 45 degrees of rotation with your pelvis, you'll probably be in good shape. Now, the issue is if you really try to do that, like really try to emphasize that, getting your pelvis around without having the range of motion that you need, it's going to lead to early extension, which is something we touched on in one of the earlier webinars, which is coming out of your posture early in order to accomplish that. So this is just somewhere where people will get into trouble where they think, okay, yeah, I need to get my pelvis going, and they force the issue and compromise their posture, compromise the quality of their strike and their consistency. It can end up being a little bit of a downward spiral. So the real key here is just being able to have that range of motion so that you don't have to force something that you're not able to do. Okay, so that's the issue that I see the most when it comes to someone that's really trying to engage their pelvis. They tend to thrust and then pivot instead of really just be able to pivot. Okay. The other thing I see that goes right with that is when you get to the top of your swing, really what should happen is lower body starts first. So this pelvis is the initiator, okay, of the forward swing. And if you look at a player like Rory McIlroy, for example, his pelvis actually begins to pivot, or his hips do, before he even finishes his backswing. That's actually what stops his turn into his backswing. So, so what I see a lot of with players is just the arms lead, okay, or the chest lead, the shoulder, the right shoulder, or their trail shoulder jumps out ahead. And then where's their hips at impact? Well, they're facing the golf ball, okay, right here. So even players that do have the ability to rotate their hips doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen if the sequence of motion is improper at the top of the swing, transitioning into the downswing. So back to you, Brian.
Cool. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I think that's a key distinction there is just because you can rotate your hips in a certain way, you still have to control that motion. I think Ryan sees a lot with people over rotating their hips. We kind of chatted about this yesterday, that you'll see with a younger population, guys and girls that are a little more nimble, their bodies move a little bit better. They have the ability to rotate their hips on the downswing and they overdo it. Whereas you get to a little bit of older population, maybe some people that aren't as athletic or they don't have that connection to their body, they just don't know how to make a turn into that hip without swaying. Okay, so I want to show a video here, and this is from TPI with Dave Phillips, he's the co-founder of TPI. This is with Jason Day. He's going to be talking about Jason Day. This will give you an idea of just kind of the way that the pros can move their hips and why it's really important in striking the ball.
2 months left this whole series.
That sounded super staticky. Let me try one more time.
Brian, we're picking up the video, but not the audio, so we can't hear Dave speak.
Okay, there's no audio there, but I'm going to shut down the audio. Let's just play. I want to play that swing though, because you'll be able to tell from the swing. And what Dave's talking about here is how Jason sits into this right hip without moving off the golf ball. Okay, so he turns and loads that right hip a lot like whoever that baseball player was. I'm forgetting his name because he's a bum on the Red Sox. And from there, he kicks the left hip forward and turns into that left hip. So on the backswing, there's a rotation without much lateral movement. And then on the downswing, there's a little bit of lateral movement to start the downswing and then a rotation into that left hip. And you can see he stands nice and tall. I want to go back to that. When he finishes that swing, he stands and he's what's called posted up on this front leg, all right? And when you're posted up on that front leg, that means that you're fully rotated and that all of your weight is now on that front side, okay? So I want to pause that right when you can see here. So, oh, Dave, damn it, Dave. Right there. So if you look at that left leg, it's completely straight and he's completely posted up because he fully rotated everything over to that left side. And if we had gone back to that picture of our average Joe swinging, he was not. He still had a lot of flex in that knee, which meant he hadn't fully rotated. So we know we need to rotate in our swing in order to effectively hit the ball. So let's say our hip rotation is kind of like mine. It's not very good. What do we do to fix it? So we did the quick test to just give you an idea of where your internal rotation is. So let's do some drills that work on that, and we can get the feeling of improving that rotation. So the first one is just an overall hip opener we use a lot. It's called the 90-90 position. Okay, so I'm going to get down on the ground. And what you're going to do is put your front leg in front, yep, bingo. And we're going to make a 90-degree angle with your lower leg and your femur. And then the back leg, we're going to do the same thing. 90-degree angle between the lower leg and your femur. All right, so this front leg is in external rotation. This back leg is an internal rotation. Most people, it'll depend, but most people are going to be a little bit tighter on the back leg internally rotating, okay? What you want to do is just get used to this position. Some of you will already be tight just getting down here, and you'll be uncomfortable in this position. That's okay. Just get some more practice getting down in this position, get comfortable down here. So what I like to do is just kneel as nice and tall as possible and lean over this front leg and just feel a little bit of a stretch in the back of the hip and lean as far as we can. Do that for a minute, 2 minutes, and then I like to add a rotation by taking that left elbow. So in this case, it's my left elbow and my right knee, and then pressing that elbow into the knee and getting a little bit more of a stretch in that hip and also in a little bit of your lower back. So we're adding a rotational component to some hip stretches here. You can also get an idea of your hip internal rotation by lifting that back foot up off the ground, okay? A lot of my clients can't even really lift that back foot off the ground. So try that, and if you can't, work on it, okay? A lot of that's about connecting to the muscles that actually internally rotate your hip, all right? So that's the 90-90 position. That's a really good starter. Number 2, we call these hip drops, windshield wipers. They've got a couple names, but you're gonna start kind of a compromising position here, but that's okay. So we're gonna spread your legs, trying to get your knees up to about 90 degrees. Not fully at 90, but as close as you can get. And we're gonna work on dropping that hip internally and trying to get that knee to the center, about the center of your midline without, you don't have to get all the way to the ground, but if you can, try. And then rotate to the other side. Now the key here, much like your swing, is to feel like we're rotating that hip in the socket and we're not just flailing our hips all over the place, because this would be the equivalent of a sway during your swing, right? I'm just going like this. There's a lot of lateral motion. With this, I'm actually making a rotation of that femur inside the acetabulum. So it's actually twisting in there. So that's what I want you to feel like. Many of you will feel like this is really, really tight, okay? That's okay. We can get better at it. So those are hip drops. It's another great way to work on internal rotation. So you can look at your internal rotation from a prone position as well. So we're gonna get on your stomach. Another compromising position for me, that's okay. Anything for the golf webinar. You're gonna have your legs up like this, and you can just rotate your feet out, okay? This is another way to look at that internal rotation. So how do we get stronger in this position? Well, let's take a band. I'm gonna put it around our ankles. That band is gonna be pulling you into external rotation. And I'm gonna be driving the feet out, okay? So this is pretty challenging. So you can either do reps of this where you're driving out against the band or just hold. The force of the band is trying to drive you into external rotation. You're going into internal. Remember, I know the feet are going out, but that's not important. What's important is that the hip is turning in, okay? And that's really what we wanna work on. So if we've worked on some internal rotation, what do we do before we play to activate those glutes? We all remember Tiger at Torrey Pines in 2007 when he had to DQ because his glutes weren't firing, okay? He's forever remembered, well, he's remembered for a lot of things, but that's one of them as well. So let's get up against the wall, and we're gonna work on that glute medius. This is that side butt muscle, all right? This is a great drill to do to activate that glute before we actually go out and play. So you're gonna get up against the wall. Your foot's gonna be a little bit bent, your knees against the wall, your shoulders against the wall. And we're gonna drive with this leg and feel like we're driving into that wall. So go ahead, get some breaths in. Try this 5 times. 3, 2, 1. Okay. You're gonna feel a really, really intense contraction in this glute med. Also the glute med that's on the wall, but this glute med, because it's stabilizing you while you're on one foot, and it's also really firing to abduct your leg, okay? So do that on both sides a couple times, or get 5 or 6 breaths in that position, and then you're gonna have the ability to really fire those glutes so we're not quitting like Tiger Woods at Torrey Pines. So, Ryan, anything else as far as how you feel about, let's talk a little bit about swaying. How do you get people to get the sensation of they're making a turn without swaying off the ball? What are some drills that you use to help with that feeling?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing that I tend to do is I'll put some type of an object off the right hip. So if you're outdoors and you've got grass that you're able to make swings off of, you don't even necessarily have to be hitting golf balls. Just like Dave Phillips had on the screen, he had that orange line off the right leg of Jason Day. You can take an alignment stick, put it in the ground, and basically have it serve as a barrier, more or less, so that you're not sliding or bumping too far to the right. Just sliding a golf club head or grip under the outside of your right foot can kind of wedge you into your stance a little bit more. I think a great thing to think about just as a visual aid, and this was from Percy Boomer, a golf instructor in the early 1900s, and he said, okay, imagine you're standing inside a pickle barrel. So you're standing inside a barrel and you don't want your right hip to bump into the barrel and you don't want your left hip to bump into the barrel. You just want to be pivoting in that barrel and not bumping into the sides of either side of it. So the thing to kind of, not to deviate too far off subject, but the thing to be aware of is that when you start to slide or move laterally in the golf swing, what tends to happen is, in the backswing at least, you're going to start to lift the golf club to finish your backswing. And this is where all types of issues can come into play in terms of quality or strike. So if you are finishing your turn, all right, that means you're turning your back all the way to the target. Your right hip or your trail hip is kind of back here over your trail ankle or heel, okay? More so your heel than your ankle, and you're here, okay? If you start to slide, what happens is then the hands and arms are going to start to lift usually. Not with everyone, but with a lot of players, and then they're coming sometimes out of their posture if their torso also lifts, or they're just elevating the club, and that's a huge power leak. If you're anyone that's trying to get extra yards and you see that you're moving too much laterally and you're lifting the club when you take a look at your swing, that's the first thing I would go to. Make sure you're, basically turning within your stance and not outside of your stance. If you get too much weight on the outside of your foot, or you can see yourself bumping into that stick, and we've got somewhere we can work to get you a little bit more centered as you pivot. There is a weight shift, and there is more pressure that's going to go on your trail leg as you turn, but you just want to be conscientious that it's not too much or it's not excessive.
Yes, definitely. Just another reminder, guys, if you have any questions for us, just leave them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So I think what Ryan talked about is really important, because in the swing, it's, one of the things it said is that there should be a lot of motion with very little movement. And what that means is there's a lot of motion without that lateral movement from left to right. And that's what he means by swinging the pickle barrel. And the internal rotation of those hips is what allows you to do it. So another indicator of if you're lacking that internal rotation is just a simple squat. So you'll hear all the time that when you take the position of a squat, maybe externally rotate your feet a little bit just to get your feet out and squat down that way. And that's great. That's fine. But if you're not able to squat with your legs and your feet straight ahead, you lose some of that ability to torque, and you lose some of that ability to turn out against the ground, and you lose some power. So if you have to turn your feet out, yes, that might make the squat a little bit more comfortable for you, but you're losing the ability to create some ground force. So you'll see it with certain players. I think Jordan Spieth is the best example, where when he gets to the bottom of his swing at impact, his left foot rolls off the ground like this. You see this with a lot of players, actually. So what that means is they kind of lack that extra internal rotation to be able to plant on that foot and post up. So in order to compensate, they've got to roll that foot a little bit, and then they actually end up leaving their feet. So Ryan, I know one of the things instructors talk about is flaring that front foot, especially with a driver, just to be able to clear that hip. Is that something that you teach or do you recommend, or does it kind of go back to being able to consistently create that ground force?
It depends on the player's range of motion. So for a lot of people, I would say more than not, particularly with longer clubs, it helps. It helps them to flare their left toe or their front toe a little bit just to facilitate that. But if you don't have to, I don't think you need to. And you're going to be able to use the ground a little bit more effectively if your toe is more square or just slightly flared. So it's the same thing in the backswing. If you need to help you rotate, you can take your trail foot and flare it out. But again, it's not something you want to do unless you really just don't have the range of motion to accomplish it without doing it.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing about a squat with, your feet turned out. If you don't have to do it, you probably shouldn't, just because, like I said, you'll be able to generate a little bit more torque, and torque is that rotational force. So if you're torquing into that hip joint, you can keep your foot relatively straight when you squat. You'll be able to squat more weight, and you'll feel like you're more stable underneath you. And I feel like you feel that way in your swing as well. If that foot is flared, you're going to feel a little bit more instability when you come down into that swing. So we talked about hip rotation. Well, the last part of it in making a full turn is actually getting that upper body to turn. All right. So we talked about this a little bit on the initial episode about posture. So if you're in that C posture where we're kind of bent over at address, it makes it hard to get into that really, even if we do have good hip rotation, we haven't really fully made that backswing. So there's a couple drills we can do to improve that rotation of your thoracic spine. So one is called thread the needle. And this is a very simple drill that we use a lot. You can do this before you play. You can do this as a way just to help gauge where your rotation is and how your thoracic spine feels. You're going to get this arm as straight as you can, and then you're going to have your opposite arm reach over. This elbow is going to bend a little bit. That's okay. And you're going to reach as far as you can, and then come back. And then reach, and then come back. So the idea here is that we're not really shifting the hips too much. We're just trying to move through that upper and middle back, okay? So we reach, then we go to the other side, reach. Same thing, we can do a drill with the club where we get the club across our chest like this, and this is called disassociating. So we're trying to disassociate the upper body from the lower body. So one of the things you'll see taught a lot now is how much separation can you get from the upper and lower body. And separation in the swing gives you time, and time gets you more power. So if my upper body and lower body are kind of moving in concert here, and there's not a lot of separation, that limits the amount of time I have in my downswing. So if I'm able to make a turn, and as Ryan said with Rory McIlroy, if his front lead hip starts to turn before his upper body, now he's got what's called separation. And then Ryan, the magical word he gets later in the swing is lag, right? Everybody wants lag. Everyone wants to swing like Sergio Garcia. But that needs to start with the motion of your body. So can you talk about some of the ways you try to improve people's separation?
Yeah, absolutely. So just like Brian's got a shoulder across his chest, sometimes I'll take a golf club or an alignment stick and put it through someone's belt loops, so you can see a little more clearly if there are two sticks or two clubs, how much separation they're actually creating. If you've ever heard the term X factor, that's something Jim McLean came up with, and it's basically the more you can turn your upper body without turning your lower body, the more torque you're going to have if you don't lose it by sliding laterally. So if you stay within your stance, okay, meaning fairly centered, at least to start, and then you turn your upper body, like the beginning of the backswing, typically what I'm looking for with most of my students is that they start by turning. You'll say turn your shoulders. You'll hear people say that, but really what's happening is you're turning your torso, okay? And the club is in your hand. So you're basically wanting to start, if you ever hear the term a one-piece takeaway, that means your hands, arms, and club are just moving in kind of in unison as one piece, and the torso's turning as much as it can, okay? So the first part of the swing is really just the torso turn, and then when your torso can't turn anymore, your pelvis is going to turn, your hips are going to turn with it, okay? So start with your upper body turning, then your lower body turns, and that'll help you finish your backswing. When players don't really turn and create this X factor, torso, so to speak, or this torque, what happens is if their hands lead, what happens is their hands get way back here ahead of their torso, and the club's going to get out of position. Or they'll start and they'll really basically take this too far with their lower body. They won't be able to finish, and then they just lift, and you see elbows starting to fly and some crazy stuff at the top. Another thing that I see a lot of is a player will start to turn a little bit, and then everything kind of goes this way. I think we've seen a lot of that. You're probably just watching people on the driving ranges. They just turn in unison, their whole body, and that's a huge power leak. So try to turn against your lower body. And when you get in that thread the needle exercise, your lower body's stabilized, and you're just trying to turn against it. And it's really just what's happening in your golf swing, where your upper body is turning, your lower body's stable in the backswing. The downswing, it's just the opposite, where the lower body's, your pelvis or your hips are turning, and you want to try to lag, that key word Brian was saying, the lag the upper body, then the torso, then the arms, and then lastly the hands. When I teach kids, the best way I can describe it to them and some adults is when you get to the top of the swing, the sequence of motion, if it was a race between your legs or your lower half, your torso, your arms and hands, first place, the gold medal would go to the lower body, okay, the turn of the pelvis. Second place, the silver medal at the finish line would be impact, okay, is your torso. Third place is the arms, and then unfortunately the hands don't medal. They finish in fourth. And so if you can follow that process on the downswing, it'll help you get into a better impact position. And that's really more of what we're going to talk about next week is impact and the finish of your golf swing. So that's really a lot of the things that we see in golf swing.
Yeah, and I think that sequencing you talked about who gets to the finish line first, a lot of that leads to that feeling of getting stuck. If that sequence is out of whack, you hear that term all the time, especially from good players, about getting stuck because that body and upper torso turn is just, their sequencing is off. But the last thing I wanted to talk about is just some of the feelings you want to have. Once again, gentlemen, we're talking about feelings, about when we actually turn into that hip. So, you hear a lot about, you want to have a tension-free swing, and you want to be loosey-goosey. You don't want to have any, you want to be as loose as you can. Maybe in your arms and in your upper body, but there should be a good amount of tension in your lower body when you swing. Because if you don't have tension, if you remember Jason Day's swing, then you don't have anything to push off of, okay? You don't have a stable base. So if you take a chair or a wall, kind of like Ryan was talking about, and we're going to practice making that turn and not a sway, and we're going to try to make a turn while this bar stool doesn't move. We're going to turn here, and I feel a lot of tension in my right hip, okay? The glute med, the TFL, those are all the muscles surrounding that hip, and then also a little bit in your groin, those adductor muscles. I want you to feel some tension there, okay? If you don't, that means you're not loading that hip correctly. And what you'll see is if you try to make a swing and this bar stool moves, there's not a lot of tension in the hip anymore, okay? So do this. Take a swing, feel that tension in the right hip, and then move the bar stool and see what happens. You lose that tension, okay? Because now you're no longer rotating. Remember the femur and acetabulum, you're no longer rotating, you're laterally moving, okay? So get that feeling of having that tension in the right hip on the downswing and then trying to move a little bit laterally and then get that tension on the left hip, okay? Or for a right-handed golfer. So tension sometimes is good. You don't want to be really stiff in your arms and your hands, but you do want to feel some tension in your hips, and at least being aware of that will help you make a better turn and help you hit the ball further, for sure. So that's all I've got, Ryan. Does anyone have any questions out there involving hip rotation, their swing, their turn? Like Ryan mentioned, we're going to go more into the impact position next week, but for anything we covered today, any questions? Going once. while you guys think of questions, I'm going to go over once again some of the online virtual offerings we have at Links. So if you're interested in that, I know people are still stuck at home. We're not going back to the gym. We do have a golf fitness program that Ryan's been doing, that I've been doing, that I designed, that will cover a lot of hip mobility. So hip mobility is probably at least 50–60% of what gets covered in the golf fitness program. So if that's something that you need to work on, and based on what we heard today, you feel like you should work on, let me know, and we'll get you set up with that. So any questions? Last call. Okay, doesn't look like there's any questions. So next week we will be back with the impact position Thursday at noon. Ryan, you got anything else?
Oh, looking forward to it. We'll just keep building.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming, and we will see you next week.